We now want to look at Abraham's steward as a positive example of how a good steward should function. We read this story in Genesis 24. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his house, who had charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but will go to my country and to my kindred and get a wife for my son Isaac." The servant here is designated as the oldest of his house, who had charge of all that he had. He is given the job to find a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac. Kent Wilson, in Steward Leadership, has done an excellent study on Abraham's servant in Genesis 24. Wilson notes that Abraham's servant had both dependent as well as independent authority. In other words, he is given a set of guidelines but is free to work within those guidelines. Wilson points out that though the servant of Abraham is never given a formal title identifying him as a steward, the descriptions of him in the passage clearly identify him in that functional role. Wilson notes 8 characteristics of the servant which reflect this independent-dependent relationship. He is in charge of everything that his master possesses. He is trusted to find an appropriate wife for the master's son. His oath is accepted and trusted by the master. His freedom to act is dependent on any explicit directions from the master. He takes the God of his master as his own God. The commitments made to the steward are the same as commitments made to the master. He is trusted to manage considerable resources, wealth, and even other servants. He is free to exercise independent judgment in how to best fulfill his obligations. The story of Abraham's steward is worth studying carefully as an example of a positive steward. Now we want to look at Joseph as an example of a faithful steward as well. As we shall see, the steward had a wide range of responsibilities involved in the household management. The stewards of high officials had significant rank and often were placed as second in command. Joseph is one such example. Joseph is also interesting because he was a steward for 3 different people: Potiphar, the jailer, and Pharaoh. We will look at those in turn. Genesis 39, 1-6. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house. For Joseph's sake, the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there was no concern for anything but the food that he ate. Most of you are probably familiar with this story. Joseph is sold into slavery by his jealous brothers to a traveling band of Ishmaelites. He is then resold to Potiphar, a high-ranking official in Egypt. Joseph performs his duties well and is quickly elevated by Potiphar, so that Joseph is put in charge of Potiphar's household and everything he owns. The narrator notes that 5 times Joseph was in charge of everything that Potiphar had, except for his food, and as we later learn, Potiphar's wife. Since Joseph frustrates the advances of Potiphar's wife, she falsely accuses him, and Joseph is thrown into prison. Though Joseph was in charge of Potiphar's house, we see that he was still a slave and subject to the whims of his master. Joseph distinguishes himself in prison and is eventually put in charge of the prison. Here again, Joseph is elevated to the position of steward. Joseph befriends both the baker and the cupbearer to the king. The baker is executed, but the cupbearer is restored to his position, though he forgets to return the favor to Joseph. Later, when Pharaoh has his dream, the cupbearer remembers his obligation to Joseph, and Joseph is placed as second in command over the palace and over the entire nation of Egypt. We can see how stewardship works in the case of Joseph, as he was steward of Potiphar, the warden, and ultimately of Pharaoh. His responsibilities were extensive and only limited in very specific ways. He did not have access to Potiphar's wife and could not take authority over the throne. We see from the example of Abraham's servant and from the example of Joseph that the steward had tremendous responsibility, but was clearly subservient to the master. The steward managed the master's resources. While the Old Testament does not use the term steward, it is clear that individuals are put in stewardship roles and that they are to manage wealth properly.